The air up here is thinner, crisp enough to sting the lungs if you breathe too deeply too quickly, and that feels appropriate given the circumstances. We are 30 days into what was supposed to be a month of reconnection, a deliberate pause from the relentless churn of our respective lives to see if what we could survive without the noise of the city, without the interruptions of board meetings and client deadlines, without the safety net of routine. I am 38 years old, and I have spent the better part of 2 decades building a career in architectural restoration. A profession that teaches you that nothing is ever truly solid unless you understand the load-bearing walls, unless you know where the stress points are, and how to reinforce them before the structure cracks. I apply that same logic to my life, to my relationships, to the way I move through the world, which is why I am standing here in the great room of this secluded estate in the Pacific Northwest, watching Julian pour himself a drink with a steady hand while my own heart hammers against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. He looks calm, impossibly so, the way he always does when the world is falling apart around him. His dark suit jacket discarded on the leather sofa, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the forearms I have traced with my fingers 1,000 times in the dark. But there is a distance in his eyes tonight, a glacial shift in the atmosphere that I felt the moment he walked through the door an hour ago. A coldness that has nothing to do with the temperature outside and everything to do with the silence stretching between us. I have known Julian for 3 years, and in that time I have learned that his silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is a vault, a place where he stores things he thinks are too heavy for me to carry, too dangerous for me to touch. He is a man who builds empires out of code and steel, a billionaire tech investor who sees the world in terms of risk mitigation and asset protection. And I suspect he views love through the same lens, as something precious that must be guarded from volatility. But tonight, the guard is up too high, the walls are too thick, and I am standing on the outside looking in, wondering if I am still a partner in this equation or if I have become a liability. We came here to fix us, to find the rhythm we lost in the shuffle of his acquisition deals and my project launches. But instead, I feel like I am walking through a house where the furniture has been rearranged while I was sleeping, where the keys no longer fit the locks, and I am trying to decide if I should pick the lock or just walk away. I do not believe in dramatic exits, in slamming doors or screaming matches that leave echoes in the hallway. I believe in clarity, in gathering the facts before rendering a verdict, and so I watch him. I watch the way the ice clinks against the crystal, the way his jaw tightens when he thinks I am not looking, the way he avoids meeting my gaze when he hands me the glass, his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second before pulling back as if burned. It started 3 days ago, a subtle shift that I might have ignored if I were less attentive, if I were the kind of woman who accepts ambiguity as a form of affection. We were having breakfast on the terrace, the fog rolling off the lake like smoke, and he received a call that he took in the study, closing the door behind him, which is not unusual for him, but the duration was. He was gone for an hour, and when he came out, his face was a mask of neutral composure, but his eyes were tired, worn down by a burden he refused to name. He told me it was work, a complication with the merger, and I accepted that because I know the weight of his responsibilities, because I know that his company employs thousands of people, and his decisions ripple out into the world in ways I cannot always see. But then came the emails, or rather, the lack of them. Julian and I share a cloud account for our joint travel plans, a practical arrangement we made early on to streamline our lives, and I noticed that he had created a new folder, encrypted, labeled with a string of characters that meant nothing to me. I am not a woman who snoops, not by nature, but I am a woman who notices patterns, and the pattern here was one of exclusion. He was planning something significant, and he was doing it behind a wall of encryption, behind the closed door of the study, behind the polite smiles he offered me at dinner when he asked if the salmon was to my liking. I told myself it was probably a surprise, a gesture of goodwill to mark the end of this 30-day trial, because Julian is capable of grand gestures, of sweeping romances that feel like scenes from a movie, but there is a difference between a surprise and a secret, and this felt like the latter. A surprise is meant to bring joy. A secret is meant to protect the holder from the reaction of the observed. I felt the shift in my chest, that cold realization that perhaps I was being managed, that perhaps this trip was not about reconnection, but about separation, about easing me into a new reality where I was no longer part of the blueprint. I am 38, and I have been loved before, enough to know the difference between the warmth of commitment and the chill of withdrawal. And I know that when a man starts protecting his assets from you, he is already halfway out the door. But I did not confront him then. I did not demand answers or throw accusations into the quiet room like grenades. I waited. I observed. I treated this like a structural assessment, looking for the hairline fractures in the foundation before declaring the building unsafe. The house itself is a character in this story. A sprawling modern structure of glass and timber perched on the edge of a cliff, designed to blend into the landscape, to be invisible against the trees, and I feel invisible here too. A ghost moving through the halls while Julian occupies the space with his physical presence, but not his emotional one. He walks through the rooms with purpose, talking on the phone in low tones, signing documents at the dining table, while I sit on the opposite end reading a book I am not actually reading. My eyes scanning the same paragraph over and over without absorbing the words. I watch the way he signs his name, the sharp angle of the J, the flourish of the N, and I wonder if he is signing away us. If there is a clause in some contract somewhere that dictates the end of our relationship, a non-disclosure agreement for the heart. It sounds cynical, I know, and perhaps it is the bitterness of past failure speaking, the memory of men who loved me until loving me became inconvenient, until the cost of my needs outweighed the benefit of my presence. But Julian is not those men. He is better than that, or at least I thought he was, which is why this confusion hurts more than a clean break would. A clean break is honest. This limbo is a form of torture, a slow erosion of trust that leaves you questioning your own perception of reality. I decided to gather evidence, not to trap him, but to understand the truth, because I cannot build a future on a foundation of guesswork. I waited until he went for his morning run, a ritual he maintains regardless of the weather, lacing up his shoes with military precision while I pretended to sleep under the heavy duvet. When the front door clicked shut, I gave him 10 minutes to clear the driveway, then I went to the study. The door was locked, which confirmed my suspicions, but I knew where he kept the spare key, a small magnetic box hidden behind a framed photograph of us taken in Napa Valley last year, a moment frozen in time when we were laughing, when the world was simple. I felt a pang of guilt as I retrieved the key, a violation of the privacy we had promised each other, but the need for clarity outweighed the discomfort of the intrusion. I told myself I was doing this for us, that if there was nothing to hide, my search would change nothing. And if there was something to hide, I needed to know what it was before I invested another day in this illusion. The study smells of leather and sandalwood, the scent of him, and I stood in the center of the room for a moment, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the decision I was making. This was the point of no return. Once I opened that drawer, once I read those files, there would be no going back to the ignorance of bliss. The computer was asleep, but not locked, which was unusual for a man so security conscious, and I wondered if it was a test, if he wanted me to look, if he was leaving a trail for me to follow. I navigated to the encrypted folder, and instead of a password prompt, it opened, as if the encryption was a facade, a way to draw attention to the contents without actually protecting them. Inside were documents, legal files, trust funds, property deeds, and my name was on all of them. I sat down in his chair, the leather creaking under my weight, and I began to read. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of discovery, the rush of data flooding my brain. There was a trust established in my name, substantial enough to secure my independence for the rest of my life, funded by his personal accounts, not the company's. There were deeds to properties, cabins in the mountains, a loft in the city, all transferred to me. There was a letter dated yesterday, addressed to me, sitting on the desk next to the keyboard. I picked it up, the paper heavy and textured, and I read the first line. It said, "In the event that I cannot convince you to stay." My breath caught in my throat, and I read on, the words blurring slightly as my eyes filled with tears I refused to let fall. He wasn't leaving me. He was trying to give me the means to leave him. The logic of it was devastatingly clear. Julian had been approached by a rival firm, a hostile takeover attempt that involved digging into the personal lives of the board members, looking for vulnerabilities, for weaknesses they could exploit in the press, in the courts, in the court of public opinion. I was a vulnerability. I was not married to him, we had no children, our lives were intertwined but not legally bound, and that made me a target. If they could prove that I was influencing his decisions, that there was a conflict of interest, they could destabilize the company, and Julian was trying to protect me from the fallout. He was setting me up with enough wealth and security that if the scandal broke, if the press came for me, I would be untouchable, independent, able to walk away from the wreckage without losing myself. But in doing so, he had created the very distance he was trying to protect me from. He thought he was being noble, sacrificing our intimacy for my safety, but he was actually destroying the trust that held us together. He was making decisions for me, assuming he knew what was best, assuming that I would prefer safety over partnership, and in doing so, he was treating me like an asset to be managed rather than a partner to be consulted. I put the letter down and I stood up, walking to the window to look out at the lake, the water gray and choppy under the overcast sky. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was not the anger of betrayal. It was the anger of exclusion. He had taken away my agency. He had decided that I was too fragile to handle the truth, too weak to stand beside him in the fire, and that hurt more than the possibility of losing the money. I am an architect. I build things to withstand storms. I do not want to be hidden in the bunker while the house takes the hit. I want to be in the house, reinforcing the walls, holding the roof up. I wanted to scream, to throw the letter across the room, to demand that he come in here and explain himself, but I stopped myself. I took a breath, deep and controlled, and I let the anger settle into resolve. This was not the end. This was a misunderstanding, a catastrophic failure of communication, but it was fixable. He was acting out of love, however misguided, and I was reacting out of pride, but beneath both of those things was the same desire: to protect what we had. The question was whether we could align our methods, whether we could find a way to face the threat together instead of apart. I heard the front door open, the sound of his boots on the hardwood floor, and I knew he was back. I did not hide the letter. I did not close the folder. I left everything exactly as I found it, and I walked out of the study to meet him in the hallway. He was wiping sweat from his forehead with a towel, his chest heaving slightly from the run, and he stopped when he saw me, his eyes dropping to the paper in my hand. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned, as if he knew this moment was inevitable, as if he had been waiting for me to find the truth so he wouldn't have to say it out loud. We stood there for a long time, the silence stretching between us, heavy with everything we hadn't said, everything we had assumed about each other. I wanted to break the silence, but I wanted to do it carefully, to choose the right words, because this conversation would determine the rest of our lives. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw the fatigue etched into the lines around his eyes, the worry that he had been carrying alone for weeks. He looked older than he had when we arrived, worn down by the burden of protecting me from a war I didn't know we were fighting. "You plan to send me away," I said, my voice steady, devoid of accusation, just stating the fact. He nodded once slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Yes," he said, his voice rough, unused. "I thought it was the only way to keep you safe." I took a step toward him, closing the distance, and I held out the letter. "You thought I needed saving," I said. "You thought I couldn't handle the pressure." He looked up then, and I saw the pain in his eyes, the fear that he had already lost me. "I thought I was losing you to the scandal," he said quietly. "I thought if you were independent, if you had your own security, you wouldn't be dragged down with me. I didn't want you to be a casualty of my business." I shook my head, feeling the tears finally spill over, hot tracks down my cheeks. "Julian, I am not a casualty. I am your partner. You don't get to make that choice for me. You don't get to decide what I can handle." He flinched, as if my words had physically struck him, and he looked away, his jaw working. "I was trying to love you," he said, the words sounding like a confession. "I was trying to protect you. And in doing so, you pushed me away," I replied, my voice softening. "You built a wall instead of a bridge. You treated me like something fragile that needed to be put in a glass case, instead of someone who could stand beside you." He stepped closer, reaching out to touch my arm, his hand warm against my skin, a stark contrast to the coldness of the last few days. "I was afraid," he admitted, the words barely a whisper. "I was afraid that if you saw the mess, if you saw the risk, you would leave. I was afraid that you would realize that loving me costs too much." I looked at him, at the man who had built an empire out of nothing, who was afraid of losing me to the very thing he had created. It was heartbreaking, this vulnerability from a man who showed so little of it to the world. "The cost is not the issue," I said, placing my hand over his. "The issue is the secrecy. The issue is that you didn't trust me enough to let me choose." He closed his eyes, leaning into my touch, and I felt the tension leave his shoulders, the rigid posture softening. "I know," he said. "I know I was wrong, I couldn't bear the thought of you getting hurt because of me." I took a deep breath, steadying myself, knowing that this was the turning point, the moment where we either broke or bonded. "I am not a child, Julian. I am a woman who loves you. And love means sharing the burden, not hiding it. If there is a storm coming, I want to be in it with you. I want to help you build the shelter." He opened his eyes and looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the shift in his expression, the realization that he had underestimated me, that he had let his fear dictate his actions. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No," I agreed gently. "You don't, but you have me, and I am not going anywhere. Not unless you ask me to leave, but you have to ask me. You have to let me choose." He shook his head vigorously. "I would never ask you to leave, I never wanted that, I just wanted you to be safe." "Then let me be safe with you," I said. "Let me be part of the solution. Let me help you fight this." We stood there in the hallway for a long time, the letter still in my hand, the truth hanging in the air between us, no longer a weapon but a bridge. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly, as if he was afraid I would disappear if he let go, and I held him back, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my chest, a rhythm that matched my own. It was not a perfect resolution. The threat was still out there. The hostile takeover was still a possibility. The legal battles were still waiting to be fought. But the distance was gone. The secrecy was gone. We were no longer two people moving around each other in the dark. We were a team, aligned again, facing the same direction. We walked back into the study together, and I sat down at the computer while he stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders, grounding me. We reviewed the documents together, discussing the strategy, the legal implications, the best way to handle the press if the story broke. I offered my perspective, my understanding of public perception, my knowledge of how to structure a narrative that protected us both. He listened, really listened, nodding, asking questions, incorporating my ideas into the plan. It was a collaboration, a partnership, and it felt better than any surprise he could have planned. The rest of the trip changed. The coldness evaporated, replaced by a warmth that felt earned, forged in the fire of that confrontation. We spent the evenings talking, not about work, but about us, about our fears, about the things we had been afraid to say. He told me about his childhood, about the instability he had grown up with, the reason he valued security so much, the reason he was so terrified of losing what he had built. I told him about my past relationships, about the times I had been sidelined, treated as an accessory rather than a partner, the reason I valued agency so much. We were dissecting our own histories, understanding the roots of our behaviors, and in doing so, we were forgiving each other. It was not easy. There were moments of frustration, moments where old habits crept back in, where he tried to take control, where I felt the urge to withdraw. But every time it happened, we stopped. We talked. We corrected the course. We treated the relationship like the structure it was, something that required maintenance, something that needed to be inspected and reinforced. I realized that love is not just a feeling. It is a practice. It is the daily choice to communicate, to trust, to be vulnerable even when it is scary. It is the willingness to look at the cracks in the foundation and fix them before they become fractures. Julian learned that protecting me did not mean hiding the truth. It meant giving me the tools to handle it. I learned that accepting his protection did not mean surrendering my independence. It meant allowing him to care for me without losing myself. We found a balance, a rhythm that worked for us, and by the end of the 30 days, we were not the same people who had arrived. We were stronger. We were clearer. We were ready. On the last night, we stood on the terrace again, the fog gone, the sky clear and filled with stars, the lake reflecting the light like a mirror. He took my hand, interlacing his fingers with mine, and he looked at me with a certainty that had been missing before. "I don't want to send you away anymore," he said. "I want to build with you." I smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over me, a deep knowing that we had survived the test. Then let's build, I said. We left the house the next morning, packing our bags together, loading the car in silence that was comfortable now, not heavy. The drive back to the city was quiet, but it was a good quiet, the kind that comes after a storm has passed, when the air is clean and the world feels new. I thought about the letter in my bag, the trust fund, the deeds. I knew what I had to do with them. When we got back to the city, I would talk to my lawyer. I would restructure the assets. I would make sure that we were protected, but that we were protected together, as a unit, not as separate entities hiding from the world. I wanted a partnership that was legal and emotional, a binding of lives that acknowledged the reality of the risks, but chose to face them anyway. I wanted marriage, not because I needed the security, but because I wanted the statement. I wanted the world to know that we were in this together, that no scandal could divide us because we were already united. I didn't tell him this yet. I wanted to plan it myself, to give him a surprise that was about commitment, not protection. The weeks that followed were busy. The hostile takeover attempt became public, just as Julian had feared, and the press descended on us like vultures, looking for blood, looking for a story about the billionaire and the woman who tempted him. But there was no scandal. There was no conflict of interest. There was only a woman who stood beside her partner, who spoke to the reporters with clarity and confidence, who explained that our relationship was personal and separate from the business, that we respected the boundaries, that we were strong. I used my voice to protect us, just as he had tried to do with his money, but my voice was more effective because it was true. I told them that I was an architect, that I built things, that I knew how to make things stand, and that our relationship was the strongest thing I had ever built. The story shifted. The narrative changed from vulnerability to strength. The stock price stabilized, the threat receded, and through it all, Julian and I remained solid. He watched me handle the press, and I saw the pride in his eyes, the respect that grew with every interview, every statement. He realized that he had been right to worry, but wrong to hide. He realized that I was capable of handling the fire, that I did not need to be saved from it. One evening, after the dust had settled, after the news cycles had moved on to something else, we were sitting on the sofa in his apartment, the city lights twinkling outside the window. He turned to me, his expression serious. "I underestimated you," he said. "I thought I was the only one who could hold the roof up." I leaned my head on his shoulder. "You don't have to hold it alone," I said. "That's what I'm here for." He kissed the top of my head, holding me close. "I know," he said, "and I'm grateful. I don't know what I would have done if I had lost you." "You didn't," I reminded him. "I'm still here. And I'm not going anywhere." The resolution of the conflict did not mean the end of challenges. Life is not a movie where everything is fixed in the final scene. There were still board meetings, still deadlines, still stresses that tested us. But the dynamic had changed. We no longer kept secrets. We no longer made unilateral decisions about our future. We talked. We planned. We checked in with each other. If he felt the urge to protect me, he told me. If I felt the urge to withdraw, I told him. We created a language of honesty that allowed us to navigate the complexities of our lives without losing each other. I learned that trust is not something you have. It is something you build, day by day, conversation by conversation. It is the accumulation of small moments where you choose to be open, where you choose to believe the best of each other, where you choose to stay when it would be easier to leave. Looking back on that trip, on those 30 days of tension and silence, I see it now as a necessary crucible. We had to break to rebuild. We had to face the fear to overcome it. If we had not found that letter, if we had not had that confrontation in the hallway, we might have drifted apart, slowly suffocated by the things we didn't say. But we didn't. We chose clarity over anger. We chose truth over comfort. And in doing so, we saved ourselves. I am 38 years old, and I have learned that love is not about finding someone who completes you. It is about finding someone who challenges you to be better, who stands with you when the world tries to knock you down, who trusts you enough to let you fight your own battles. Julian is that man. He is not perfect. He is still guarded sometimes. He still worries too much. But he is learning, and I am learning too. We are learning together. The story of us is not a fairy tale. It is a real story with real problems and real solutions. It is a story about two people who decided that what they had was worth fighting for, worth the discomfort of honesty, worth the risk of vulnerability. It is a story about a woman who refused to be saved and a man who learned to let her stand. And it is a story that is still being written, one day at a time, one conversation at a time. I look at Julian now, across the breakfast table, the sunlight hitting his face, and I see the man I love, not the billionaire, not the CEO, just the man. He catches my eye and smiles, a genuine smile that reaches his eyes, and I smile back. We don't need to say anything. We know. We know that we are trapped together, not by circumstance, but by choice. And it is the best kind of trap there is. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from knowing you have survived the worst-case scenario and come out the other side intact. It is not the peace of ignorance, the peace of not knowing what could go wrong. It is the peace of knowledge, the peace of knowing what could go wrong and knowing that you can handle it. That is what I feel now. I feel capable. I feel secure. Not because of the money in the trust fund, not because of the deeds to the properties, but because of the man sitting across from me. I know that if the world falls apart, we will rebuild it. I know that if the storms come, we will weather them. I know that I am not alone. And that knowledge is worth more than any asset he could ever transfer to my name. It is the only security that matters. I think about the women who might read this, who might be in similar situations, facing the coldness of a partner who thinks they are protecting them by shutting them out. I want to tell them to wait. I want to tell them to look for the truth before they pack their bags. I want to tell them that sometimes the distance is not a sign of leaving, but a sign of fear. I want to tell them that communication is the only way through. It is not easy. It requires courage. It requires you to swallow your pride and ask the hard questions. It requires you to listen to the answers even when they hurt. But it is worth it, because on the other side of the misunderstanding is a love that is deeper, stronger, more resilient than it was before. It is a love that has been tested and found true. The trip ended, but the journey continued. We went back to work, back to the city, back to the noise. But we carried the silence of the house with us, the memory of the conversation in the hallway. We carried the understanding that we are a team. When the stress mounts, when the deadlines loom, we remind each other. We check in. We make sure the foundation is solid. We do not let the cracks grow. We fix them immediately. It is a discipline, this love. It is work. But it is the best work I have ever done. It is the project of a lifetime, and I am not afraid of the labor. I am an architect. I know how to build, and I know how to make things last. Julian reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb tracing the line of my knuckles. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I looked at him, at the love in his eyes, the trust that had been restored. "I'm thinking about the future," I said. "I'm thinking about what we're going to build next." He smiled, squeezing my hand. "Anything," he said. "As long as we build it together," I nodded. "Together," I agreed, and that was the promise, that was the vow. Not spoken in a church, not written on a contract, but lived in the quiet moments, in the shared glances, in the willingness to face the truth. We were trapped on a 30-day trip with a cold billionaire, or so I thought. But in reality, we were trapped in love, and there was no escape, and I didn't want one. I wanted the trap. I wanted the commitment. I wanted the certainty that no matter what happened, we would face it side by side. The sun rose higher, burning off the last of the morning chill, and the room filled with light. It was a new day. It was a new beginning, and I was ready. I was ready for the work, for the love, for the life. I took a sip of my coffee, the warmth spreading through me, and I looked at Julian, my partner, my love, my equal. We had survived the winter. Now it was time for the spring. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that we would bloom. The misunderstanding had shattered, but the relationship had not. It had been forged in the fire of the truth, and it was stronger than ever. I had sought clarity, and I had found it. I had sought truth, and I had found it. And in finding it, I had found myself, and I had found him. And that was enough. That was everything. The narrative of our life is not written by the outside world. It is not written by the press, or the rivals, or the skeptics. It is written by us, every day, every choice, every word. We hold the pen, and we are writing a story of resilience, a story of trust, a story of love that refuses to be broken. I am Jayana. I am 38 years old, and I am loved. Not in spite of who I am, but because of who I am. And that is the greatest resolution of all. The coldness is gone. The warmth remains, and I am home. Not in a house, not in a city, but in a relationship that feels like sanctuary. That is the goal, That is the destination, and we have arrived, together. I remember the moment I found the letter, the shock of it, the fear. It feels like a lifetime ago now. It was the catalyst. It was the push we needed to stop drifting and start steering. I am grateful for it, in a strange way. If I hadn't found it, we might have continued on that path of silent separation until there was nothing left to save. But we found it, we faced it, we fixed it. And now we are here. The view from where I stand is clear. The horizon is open, and I am not afraid of what lies ahead, because I know who is walking beside me. I know that he will not hide the truth from me again. I know that he will not try to save me from myself. I know that he will let me be the woman I am, and I know that I will let him be the man he is. We accept each other, flaws and all, fears and all, and that acceptance is the foundation of everything. The world outside is chaotic, it is loud, it is demanding, but in here, in this space we have created, it is quiet, it is safe, it is ours. We have built a fortress not of walls, but of trust, and no storm can breach it, no scandal can break it, no misunderstanding can undo it, because we have the tools to repair it. We have the communication, we have the love, and we have the will. That is the secret, that is the key. It is not about having a perfect relationship, it is about having a resilient one. It is about knowing that when things break, you can fix them, and we know how to fix them. We have the blueprint, we have the materials, we have the time, and we have each other. So I sit here in the light with his hand in mine, and I breathe in the peace, I breathe in the certainty, I breathe in the love. And I know that I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Trapped, yes, but willingly, happily, completely. And I would not have it any other way. The 30 days are over, but the rest of our lives are just beginning. And I am ready for every single day of it. I am ready for the challenges, I am ready for the joys, I am ready for the truth, because the truth is where the love lives, and the love is real, and it is ours, and it is forever.